Is there a place for red-faced screaming? Find out next on 10 Tenets of Leadership. Welcome to this episode of 10 Tenets of Leadership. I'm Andy McCaskey from STR News, and today we're going to be talking about contention and conflict within the enterprise. Our host, as always, Larry Pendergrass.
Thank you, Andy. Good morning. Good morning. I'd also like to welcome Paul Zygielbaum. Paul, would you introduce yourself, please?
Thank you, Larry. I have been I'm an engineer by training and have been an engineer and manager and executive in several industries in my career, and recently retired as CEO of a medical device startup, C8 Metasensors.
Great. Welcome, Paul. And we also have Steve Fossi here today. Steve.
Good morning, Larry. Currently, I'm at Symmetricom. I'm the Director of New Business Development. In previous lives, I spent a lot of time at HP and Agilent over 27 years, and a lot of what I'll talk about today comes from my experiences at HP and Agilent.
Thanks for joining us. We're going to have a discussion today about constructive contention in the workplace. And this is one of the 10 tenets of leadership. Just briefly, this tenet describes the need to have an environment where people are free to put information out on the table, sort through it in a constructive way, allow for some contention. People naturally have disagreements in the workplace, allow for that, but do it with respect, do it constructively. So we'll talk today a little bit about people's experience in this area and contrast it perhaps with some of the things that we've heard about in the news, etc. And I'd like to first turn, if I can, to Paul and ask Paul, what is your experience, pro or con, with this tenet?
That's a great question, and I was thinking about that before we began, and I realized that I've been both a beneficiary of good experience when that tenet has been practiced and a victim of the situation when it has not in my career. And of course, that's how I learned what I learned about this tenet myself. I would say that in a number of cases in my career, there have been times when I've had either a member of a team or even a leader of the team who practiced what I would call either intimidation or lack of respect for the rest of the team members and shut off contention, which meant that the leader never got access to the information that was really important. And then I've both been involved in teams and led teams that got to the point where they could, in fact, get all the elephants out on the table and discuss them openly and use fact rather than opinion to solve issues.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So it sounds to me like you've had both experiences where it's been used and not used. Have you seen a situation where constructive contention actually turned out not to work in the workplace very well?
I would say the only time I've seen that happen is when the team itself that was trying to practice it had not built up mutual trust and respect to the point where the facts mattered to them. They weren't receptive to the facts. They were hung up in their opinions.
Right. Yeah. Good point. There's a great book, very small one that your readers, your viewers could look at here, Andy, called "The 5 Dysfunctions of a Team." Certainly, one of the things that's talked about in there is that need for mutual trust as a base for building a great teamwork and be able to get to the point where you have something like this constructive contention. So, how about you, Steve? What kind of experience have you had in the workplace with this tenet?
Like Paul, I had both good and bad experiences with contention in the workplace. I was on the senior staff of a large division inside of HP, where we actually set it up to have constructive contention, and it worked really well. And I think the reason it worked really well was we had put some thought into it up front as to how to create what we regarded as the right amount of contention. Not too much and not too little. And it worked very well. We had the division divided into 4 business teams, but the resources were divided by skill set. So, for example, there was a manager for all software engineers and then the software engineers were allocated out to the businesses based on projects. And there was a constructive tension deliberately set up between the needs of the software engineers to get training and to do common methodologies versus the needs of the businesses to get things done. And that was all laid out ahead of time before we went to that model. And it worked really well. The software engineers felt like people were paying attention to their careers and their professional development. And at the same time, the business teams got the resources they needed to move ahead.
Yeah, very good. So in the spectrum of what we might imagine for contention, you can imagine no contention at all in the workplace on one end and destructive contention on the other end of the spectrum. So Paul, you've just you've opened this discussion a few minutes ago, but what really causes a no contention environment? And what, on the other extreme, what causes a destructive contention environment? And do you think sometimes people try to produce those?
Very good question, Larry. Set of questions. I think what creates no contention, in my experience, what I have seen, there are probably other ways to create that, but the cases I've known about have been cases where the leader of the team actually wanted to impose his own ideas, his or her own ideas, on the team, and had already preconceived all the solutions and information that was necessary. And as things progressed on the project, was not interested in how things were changing that might affect those answers. And so I watched that happen. I even watched a manager go around his room, basically state all of his objectives and how they're going to be achieved, and go around and ask everyone in the room their opinions and shoot down all the opinions. So by the third staff meeting, no one ventured opinions, and nothing got done, by the way. So that was an extreme case. And you asked the question, I mean, do people intentionally do that? Well, there are certainly some dysfunctional managers who try to simply prove that they're the smartest people in the room. That can also happen with individual members of teams. When it's a new team, there's not a lot of trust built up yet, or it's a team that has had a lot of dysfunctional history, there can be individuals who try to simply impose what they want on others.
Now, so some people think that an environment of even destructive contention brings out the best in people. And so, Steve, what do you think about that? I think that there are certain famous leaders that talk about producing this kind of environment. What do you think?
Not a big fan, Larry. I think most people are willing to offer up their opinions, but they're not willing to get into it. A lot of people are not willing to get into a food fight over it. And in my time at HP and Agilent, I was in some very intense meetings with very strongly expressed opinions, but it was after everybody knew each other and the respect and the trust was in place, so that you could have these heated arguments and everybody understood that you were doing it for the good of the business and not because you were just trying to advance your own career or something like that. So it has to be in the right environment. Otherwise, it's just, who can yell the loudest and beat their chest the hardest. And typically that's not the best solution.
So a common theme I'm hearing here is that you really need to set that platform of trust, and then actually the constructive contention can get more contentious. People can tolerate it more because they know that the people they're working with have the same agenda that they do, and they have some trust. That's right.
Yeah, I think that's right. I was running a business for semiconductor test for a while at Agilent, and I worked for my boss ran several of these divisions, and we all knew each other. We had all known each other for years, and we got into this discussion about ranking, and the idea that was floated by my boss was maybe the bottom 5% of ranking should leave the company. And there were 3 guys who thought that wasn't a bad idea, and there were 3 guys who thought that was the dumbest idea we'd ever heard. And we spent about 90 minutes yelling at each other over this. And the amazing thing was we all walked out of the room still friends and, still believing in each other and what we were trying to do and having reached a decision. But we were only able to do that because we had all known each other for years and we had the trust in place.
So whether or not you perceive that you're disrespecting each other has a lot to do with whether that trust is already in place.
Yeah.
You can, for instance, yell at somebody who doesn't know you, and there's the implication that there's some disrespect there. Whereas if you have a strong relationship, it may be otherwise. Is that right?
Well, in general, yeah. I mean, if you're yelling at somebody that you don't know and they don't know you, it's going to come across as bullying. I mean, there's no other way, right? But if you have the relationship in place and they know, where you're coming from, then you can get a little more animated about the whole thing.
So, Paul, where does yelling, in your opinion, fit in the workplace? Is it a part of constructive contention? If people are pounding their fist on the table and really getting red-faced, is this still constructive contention?
It's a very good question. I'm thinking about some events I've witnessed and been part of like that. And I would say there are times when some individuals, even in an environment of trust, when trust has built up, who will get so angry about a particular issue that they'll be pounding the table, they feel so strongly about it, or even get up and walk out of the room. I've seen that happen. What I noticed is if that happens in a team that has been through the change process of getting to the point where openness is the natural way, and they're doing their contention based on fact exchange and not just opinion exchange, it actually is not destructive. It's a little harmful in the sense that, let's say a person gets up and leaves the room, it leaves the rest of the people feeling let down, by that person. But in the long run, what I've noticed is it actually strengthens the team, because when the team gets back together, there's more openness. And that's a very interesting result that's almost counterintuitive. And I think I go along with Steve. It depends on how much trust has been built up. And that is a direct function of the leadership of that team.
One of the things you said, Paul, that I relate to is the idea that teamwork is actually developed through people working together on an issue for some period of time, maybe having several battles that they've won together. I've always felt that teamwork was really developed by people slugging through a problem together as opposed to teamwork exercises. Is that the way you see it?
Oh, absolutely. The exercises are like kindergarten in my mind. The real teamwork comes from working together to solve a difficult problem. And in fact, I've actually taken the position and worked in situations where I've had team members who were not getting along, assigned them to accomplish something together. And by the end of it, if it's well led, they in fact learn to trust each other.
Yeah, makes sense. Makes sense. So Steve, can you go too far with this whole idea of constructive contention? Are there right times or wrong times? You mentioned that you had a situation where you consciously decided as a group what too much or too little was and targeted for that. So tell me about that. What is too much or too little a contention?
Well, what we were trying for was a state that I think is hard to define, that you would get better answers, more creative answers than if you just accepted, someone's decision at face value. And that was sort of consciously put into the system. It was a formal matrix organization, and that was consciously put into the matrix structure before we rolled it out to the team. And we actually thought about that and said, okay, how do we get people to get creative and think a bit outside their comfort zone, but at the same time not just get so freaked out that they lock up and don't offer any kind of solution. And we took our best shot at it, and then we tweaked things along the way, where we thought, okay, maybe this part of the matrix has a little too much power, or maybe this other part doesn't have enough, and we tweaked things along the way. And it took us from the time we rolled it out until the time everybody generally acknowledged that it was going smoothly. It took about 2 years, but it worked pretty well from the get-go. But until we all felt, yeah, this is going okay, it was about 2 years.
So I'm wondering if there are then right and wrong times to argue. I mean, some people say that you should never disagree with your boss in public, for instance. So let's take this constructive contention then to, when is it appropriate, even in an environment where a culture where constructive contention is appreciated? Paul, what do you think?
Well, there are definitely, I wouldn't call it necessarily right and wrong times. There are better and worse times, in my view. For example, attempts at constructive conflict, when the team isn't ready for that, probably not going to work. And so I view it as a process of getting the team to the point where they're ready to do that in small stages. It happens in steps. And I pick up on something Steve said. He said there's a hard to define process in there, or state. And I know, because I've led teams through this several times in my career, dysfunctional teams that I took over. I know that I can predict how long it'll take me to get them to where they can be fully open with each other. And I can recognize those stages, but I'd be hard pressed to figure out how to express what those points are, except that you see it in unspoken language, body language. You see it in the way people listen to each other, the listening skills that are applied and the respect that's shown. And as that develops, you can allow for and even encourage and I would say as a leader, incite constructive criticism or constructive conflict among the team members, but you need to be careful how you do that. And so if it's initiated by the team themselves, I think as a leader, you have to watch that process and protect the weaker members of the team.
Mm-hmm. That's a good part of change management and your change management thoughts.
Yeah.
It sounds like, yeah, that's good. So Steve, if you're in a large group meeting, the CEO is up there speaking, and you disagree with one of those points, are you going to stand up and point it out there, or is that part of constructive contention?
No. When I was in
a career-limiting move, huh?
Yeah.
Well, it's just not the right spot. You can certainly disagree with it, but it doesn't do you or the CEO or the team any good for you to stand up in a large group and say, "Hey, that's a load of crap." You may think that, but you can tell him or her that later on. When I was in the matrixed organization that I was referring to, we actually developed a decision-making model. And that sounds really fancy, but it was actually 4 or 5 bullet points on a slide. And we actually made it into a little poster that we hung up in the room where we held our staff meetings, so that when other people in the division would use that room for meetings, they would see, here's how we make decisions. And, we didn't try and keep it secret. We told everybody about it. We kept that poster up in the room the whole time. And basically it was a model of, hey, the boss can propose an answer. We have a debate. It's okay to take timeouts during the debate if we feel we're getting off topic or off process. And then if we reach a consensus, we go with that. If we don't, the boss has the right to make the final choice so that we don't get hung up. And then we walk out of the room and we all support that decision. But what's implicit in that is that the disagreements are in the staff meeting. They're not out when you're out in front of the team.
Great. Yeah, I think that's really, really good. A good practice. You, of course, if you have something like that in your company and you move to a different company, I found that you actually do have to be pretty careful to try to learn quickly what their decision methods are. Yeah. So I've been in a situation where I expected this constructive contention behind closed doors, and then everybody would come to a conclusion. You go out and support it as a staff. And yet I found myself headlong in where I thought I was still in a constructive contention phase, but the boss had already made a decision and wasn't so clear about communicating it. So you do certainly have to be careful.
And I was going to say, I'm sorry, Steve, just a thought. One of the symptoms I noticed that it's not to the point where it's working is, of course, if you go through a process as Steve proposed or described, and then you find out that some either destructive or constructive conflict is happening outside the team process. Yeah. You've got a problem.
Yeah. Right.
And that's what I was going to say was, you were describing, Larry, the process where the boss has made up his mind. He just hasn't told anybody.
Right.
I've witnessed the reverse, where the boss has made up his mind, he's announced it, but one or more members of his staff has done a pocket veto on it and isn't out there supporting it because he didn't agree with it. You know?
Right.
And that's, as you know, that's just fantastically destructive. And,
Absolutely.
And that's why you have to be able to debate those things openly at the staff level, so that when you do walk out of the room with the decision, everybody backs it up.
Tremendous, yeah. So, as kind of a final thought here, I'm wondering what are the things that you would tell other people who are interested in moving from, say, a destructive or a no contention environment toward this constructive contention? How do you create this kind of environment? Why don't we start with Paul?
And I look back to how I've done this, and the first thing you have to do as a leader is actually demonstrate openly, actively, that you as a leader are open to having your position criticized, right? And to new information or to things you didn't notice. And I think that beyond that, then you have to show that you respect that information. You also have to set an example of not just taking a person's opinion as key information, but asking that person, okay, that's the opinion you've stated. Now, what in your experience brings you to that opinion? And then you start to get to the facts behind that person's thinking, and that's what's really key.
Yeah, good point. Yeah, Steve, how about your experiences here?
I guess my advice would be, first of all, a lot of people think that, we're going to redraw the org chart and we're done. And the difficult fact to accept is that, you can redraw an org chart in a day. And if you really want the changes to stick, you're going to spend the next year to 2 years implementing the implications of what you just redrew on the org chart in a day. And so that would be my one piece of advice is, don't think you're done the day you redraw the org chart. In fact, you're just getting started. The other piece of advice I would offer is something that Paul touched on, is you can actually learn methods and languages that encourage constructive contention. As Paul alluded to, people saying, here's what I believe, here's the evidence for why I believe that, but I'm open to someone else offering evidence that seems to disagree with that. So you can actually learn a language that the teams can speak to each other that will prevent them from getting defensive and digging in, and encourage sort of an open inquiry into the problem you're trying to solve. And that would be my other piece of advice, is take the time to learn some of those techniques because they really do help.
Great, thank you. Actually, we've talked about constructive contention, and we've also talked about change management quite a bit in this session. Maybe we'll be back at a later time talking about 10 tenets of change management. I wanted to thank you both, Paul and Steve, for joining me on this episode, and appreciate your wisdom, and thanks a lot for coming to SDR News.
Thanks for inviting me.
Happy to be here. Thank you.
Thanks to both of you for joining us here today. Really great session. I've been taking a lot of notes, and found out that maybe there is a place for a little bit of red-faced screaming, as long as you're able to deliver that respectfully. Thanks to you folks for joining us as well. We'll see you next time on 10 Tenets of Leadership.